Good morning or good evening. It is 1:30 a.m. on January 23rd, 2025, and today I would like to talk about processes in our daily lives and how we fail to optimize them majority of the time. I don't particularly think that life should be outlined as a process, and that there's a certain pathway or a set of steps necessary to achieve some final finite goal or um, goal within a specific space or boundary. Um, but I do think processes as a whole, as in methodologies and modes of thought, are not taken seriously. Specifically, I would like to kind of explore or navigate rather my ideals of a zero sum thought process and how that affects my day to day choices. So, yeah, um, for some context, yeah, for some context, I do believe that a zero sum mode of thought leads to room for goodness, growth, and uh, honesty. I guess I mean honesty in the the idea that transparency, niceness, and forgiveness is essential to leading a good life. So, by honesty, I mean um, because it's zero sum, it equals out to a point where there's nothing to really hide or protect. So, comedically, I a couple months ago, I was at a Tim Hortons near my university where there is a lot of drug addicts and homeless people. And I had, I ended up buying two breakfast sandwiches because it was a deal. And I had a pack of cigarettes. And as this homeless person opened the door for me, and I exited, I offered him the choice between a cigarette or a sandwich. And he took the, um, he took the cigarette. And I think that's really funny, but does coincide with this mode of zero sum because in that moment, no matter what he picked what he chose or what he wanted, and in such, since he got what he wanted from me, I gained, or I lost the point rather, right? So I'm at a point or a position of -1, and in such later in that day, um, I was able to enjoy my time with some friends, and for what that is, that's a +1, equating to a zero sum. So by offering something or by being given something, I feel required or obligated to do the opposite. So whatever it may be, there's the vice versa alternative. Um, so zero sum has many different applications. I also another funny story, not so funny, more so gruesome. I went on a camping trip with a couple friends, and I told my friend that if he were to burn this frog alive, the death of that frog would actually have a set of complications based on the result, right? So assuming the frog dies, that's losing a point, but assuming that he's happy, he gains a point, meaning it's zero sum. And so logically, it would never be worth it because his actions, assuming that the death of a frog is equal to one's emotions, what's it called? Which is a bit unfair, but take it for what it is. A -1, a position of being -1, and a position of being +1, at best can equate to zero, right? Should my friend have been sad, that's -2, right? Which is awfully negative, which is absolutely not worth it. But as you can see, you're able to kind of differentiate between which situations are even profitable for you. And so I don't know if this mode of thought is at an echelon of being genius, but it definitely is a part of being frugally smart um, with your choices. Um, so yeah, so with some context or background provided of what zero sum can look like, This is applied in my day-to-day life in every way. Um, and I guess it could be synonymous to karma, but karma is not as methodical as having your decision making done in a mathematical method. Let me get a sip of water first. So this one-to-one thought by I feel that because selfishness is so inherent to human beings, it's a way of like forcing myself to relinquish that selfishness. So any greed that coincides with garnering money needs to be redistributed in another way. Any greed of me, bumming a cigarette off a friend or something, even though I don't really do that, needs to be relinquished in another way. Um, Me speaking about myself and my ideals and my thoughts and my opinions to peers and those around me needs to be relinquished in some sort of way, whether it be explaining my modes of thoughts or explaining my methodologies to other people. By educating, I also am selfishly speaking upon myself, which always results in a zero sum. And I think that's beautiful because it's naturally right. And speaking of naturalness, in the field of mathematics, a natural number, depending on who you talk to, includes and does not include zero, and it is especially does not include negative integers. So what's natural is arguably what's real and physical. However, it's undermined that negative numbers or integers hold just as much meaningful value. And acknowledging this is important because by having an infinite amount of positives, but absolutely neglecting the set of negatives, we're assuming that everything is positively real, which is very unbalanced. And an unbalanced individual, I feel, offers too much or takes too much, and in such they could, you know, be a pushover or they can be greedy, which are two arguably bad traits. There's a difference between the traits necessary to survive in the modern world, especially in the zeitgeist of money and um, uh, financial success and security. However, I don't think that a modern life, in contrast to that of a historical one, offers the same value because the context is so different. But a good life, however, leading a life of honesty, leading a life of um, transparency instead of opaqueness, leading a life of niceness instead of evil, living a life of forgiveness instead of resentment. No matter the context, those virtuous traits will always be a predicate of a good human being because there is no commodity that affects it, such as money in modern times, or or bartered goods in the Middle Ages, or slaves in the dawn of time, or even beyond, in a biblical sense, you know, consuming an apple for curiosity, like all of which is for what we assume to be a negative. There's always a positive contrast, and a good life will always reject the evilness in that same time, and that will always equal zero sum, assuming that the values are always equal to positive and negative one. Um, so, how does this have any relevance to processes? So now that the context is actually completely out the way, processes, especially in day-to-day lives, like decision making and planning and all of these different short-term achievements, not an end-all be-all ideal to completing a life. Processes are seen and they're very meticulous. They can be very monotonous, so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, by making food for yourself, that's a process. But how do you optimize that, right? By achieving a healthy lifestyle, is that discipline because you're putting yourself in a harder position, or is that just straight up inefficiency because you're putting yourself in a position of putting in more effort for arguably a better result. But who knows, right? The value is off centered. But then there's the flip side to that, right? Like putting in less effort into your food and always buying out, you can receive negative effects by eating bad food. You don't know what's inside of it. You don't truly know the nutritional values. There's so many instances, but by approaching everything in a positive and negative um, way, I feel that you'll always have some sort of ground to understand how to best approach a situation, whether or not the results will always equal zero. Because you will never know the resultant if there is a process that preludes to that. Um, and I don't think a lot of people put in enough time to understand